Welcome back to the U.S. Navy History Podcast. I am Dale, and I'm joined by the Christoph.
Hello, everyone. So glad that you're here today.
For nearly 80 years, one assumption has gone largely unchallenged in American naval history. The battleship era was over. When the last Iowa-class battleships were decommissioned in the early 1990s, they were widely seen as the final chapter in a story that began at Trafalgar, matured at Jutland, and reached its violent peak at places like Pearl Harbor and Leyte Gulf. Big guns had given way to aircraft, armor had given way to missiles, and the battleship, it seemed, had passed permanently into history. Until now. In December of 2025, a surprising announcement reignited one of the longest-running debates in naval warfare, with the unveiling of what has been described as the Trump-class battleship. Not a museum ship, not a reactivation, but a proposal for a new American capital surface combatant. One that deliberately evokes the battleship tradition while embracing 21st century technology. Whether this ship will ever be built remains uncertain, but the announcement alone has already made history, because it forces us to ask a question the Navy has not seriously confronted in generations. Is there still a place for a battleship in modern war? The United States Navy has not designed or constructed a battleship since World War II. Every major surface combatant since then, cruisers, destroyers, carriers, has followed a very different philosophy. Speed, sensors, missiles, and air power. So when news emerged of a proposed guided missile battleship, it immediately stood out, not just as a ship design, but as a statement. It was not about nostalgia alone. It was about firepower, survivability, presence, and the changing nature of great power competition at sea. Supporters framed it as a response to a world where peer navies are expanding. Missiles are multiplying, and the United States can no longer assume uncontested control of the oceans. Meanwhile, critics asked whether the battleship, even a modernized one, solves problems that do not exist at extraordinary cost. To understand this moment, we need to step back, not just into recent policy debates, but into the long arc of U.S. naval history. For most of the 20th century, battleships were the ultimate expression of national power. They were floating fortresses designed to fight other battleships, absorb punishment, and deliver devastating gunfire. The United States perfected this concept with the Iowa class, ships that combined speed, armor, and 9 16-inch guns capable of firing shells heavier than most modern cars. Yet even the Iowa class did not escape history. Aircraft carriers proved more flexible. Missiles outranged guns, and by the Cold War's end, battleships no longer fit the Navy's evolving doctrine. Their retirement seemed final, but their legacy never disappeared. Naval gunfire support remained valuable. Survivability remained attractive, and the psychological impact of a massive surface warship never faded. The, and I say this in quotes, Trump-class proposal draws directly from that legacy, while attempting to redefine it. According to the announcement and publicly available design descriptions, the Trump-class battleship is envisioned not as a traditional gun battleship, but as a large, heavily armed, guided missile surface combatant. In size, it would rival historic capital ships. In armament, it would reflect modern warfare. Rather than focusing solely on big guns, the design emphasizes large missile capacity, advanced air and missile defense, long-range strike capability, and emerging technologies such as directed energy weapons. In other words, this is not an Iowa with updated electronics. It is an attempt to create a capital ship for a missile era. one that combines presence, protection, and firepower in a single hull. Whether that combination makes strategic sense is the debate now unfolding. Even the name, Trump class, is historically significant. Naming major warships after presidents is not new. Aircraft carriers bearing presidential names have served for decades. But naming a surface combatant class after a contemporary political figure immediately ensured controversy and attention. Supporters argue it signals confidence and national ambition. Critics argue it politicizes shipbuilding and complicates long-standing naval naming traditions. Regardless of where one stands, the effect is undeniable. People are talking about battleships again. This episode is not about celebrating or condemning the Trump-class battleship. It is about understanding it. Where did this idea come from? What problems is it trying to solve? How does it fit into U.S. naval doctrine? And what does it say about the future of sea power? Because whether or not a single keel is ever laid, the proposal itself tells us something important about how the United States views the ocean and its place in the world. And that is a story worth telling.
I am highly interested in this subject. Battleships are cool, number one. I think I cannot tell you the number of times that I've watched YouTube videos that show railguns in action in slow motion and how they say, yeah, this is really, it only works on a large ship. That's the only place we can fit this weapon given the energy demands and the size and everything. And I'm like, okay, that makes sense. I guess one day we'll have a ship that can do that. And same thing with lasers. I think they're really leaning into that. And as missiles become more and more common in ships around the world, some form of anti-missile technology will be necessary. So I can see those two things fitting. As far as battleship in the modern Navy, I don't see it, but that just could be a limit of my imagination or my ignorance of the problems at hand or the way things are stacked up worldwide and who the enemies are or what operations we need to do. We've spoken many times in several episodes about what battleships have contributed to the effort of the U.S. Navy and how important they've been. And I can see something that is sturdy and can withstand multiple hits and still not be a complete loss would be extremely valuable. If you're going to pour, what I can only imagine is billions of dollars into building a ship, you don't want that to become a piece of scrap at the bottom of the ocean. At the same time, if you armor it so much, how agile are you going to be able to be in the open ocean? This really brings up a lot of questions for me. What technologies does everybody have? How does this counter or bring an advantage to the U.S. Navy? So I'd love to hear more details, and then we can talk about it a little bit more as we go through.
Lucky for you, we're going to cover all of that.
Yes!
To understand why the idea of a new American battleship keeps resurfacing, we have to return to the moment the battleship was supposedly laid to rest. Because the truth is, it never really went away. When the last Iowa-class battleships were decommissioned, in the early 1990s, their retirement was framed as inevitable. The Cold War was ending, budgets were shrinking, missiles and aircraft ruled the seas. And yet, the Iowa class had already defied expectations once before. They had returned to service during the Korean War. They had returned again during Vietnam. And in the 1980s, they returned yet again, modernized with cruise missiles, electronic warfare systems, and advanced radar. Each time, the Navy found reasons to bring them back. Why? Because battleships offered something few other platforms could: survivable, sustained firepower close to shore. That lesson never fully faded. Even in the missile age, battleships retained unique advantages. They could absorb damage and stay in the fight. They could loiter offshore for weeks. They could deliver massive firepower without relying on airfields or vulnerable logistic chains. During the Gulf War in 1991, the battleships Missouri and Wisconsin fired hundreds of shells and cruise missiles, striking targets deep inland while Iraqi forces watched helplessly. That was not nostalgia. That was capability. And naval planners took note. Since the retirement of the Iowa class, the Navy has faced a persistent challenge. How do you provide heavy fire support near hostile shores? A surface ship that can survive missile saturation, and a visible symbol of presence and deterrence. Destroyers and cruisers can do many things, but they are lightly armored. Aircraft carriers project enormous power, but they are extremely valuable and carefully protected assets. What the Navy has lacked is a hard, heavily defended service combatant designed to take punishment and keep fighting. That gap never truly disappeared. The world that produced the Trump-class proposal looks very different from the post-Cold War moment. Potential adversaries now field long-range anti-ship missiles, hypersonic weapons, dense air defense networks, and large numbers of land-based launch platforms. In this environment, assumptions about uncontested naval dominance no longer holds. Supporters of the Trump class argue that the Navy needs a ship that can operate inside congested zones, not just from a distance. A ship that can take hits, a ship that can keep shooting, and a ship that can serve both as shield and spear. That argument echoes debates from nearly a century ago, but with new technology layered on top. Critics often say missiles made battleships obsolete. That is only partially true. Missiles replaced guns as the primary offensive weapon, but they also introduced new vulnerabilities. Missile ships tend to rely on speed, sensors, and layered defenses rather than armor. The Trump-class proposal attempts to merge the two philosophies. Missile-centric firepower with greater survivability and redundancies on a much larger hull. In essence, it is an effort to apply battleship thinking to missile warfare. Whether that can be done affordably or effectively remains an open question. There is also a cultural element at play. The battleship occupies a special place in American naval memory. It represents industrial strength, visible power, and national resolve. From the Great White Fleet to Battleship Row, these ships have always carried symbolic weight far beyond their tactical value. The Trump-class proposal taps into that legacy, intentionally or not. And that symbolism matters, especially in an era of renewed great power competition. At this stage, it is critical to remember what the Trump class is and what it is not. It is not a completed design. It is not under construction. It is not yet funded. It is a concept, a statement of intent, and a challenge to prevailing assumptions. But concepts have power. They shape debates, they influence budgets, and they reinforce institutions to reconsider old answers. And that is exactly what this proposal has already done.
I am really curious about this because I'm sure whenever they announce a new type of ship, I have to imagine that there were planners for years, going back many years, that had proposals, initial designs already drafted. And I know there's a lot of details that go into a humongous ship, but I wonder, let's say this is approved today. How long until we see a ship like this? Because a design, I'm sure, takes over a decade, and then construction, definitely over a year. This is a long-term thing. And so I'm wondering how much anticipation is at play. So knowing that it takes this long to get a ship to sea, is there something that people in the know where they have to say, oh, we need to be ready in the next 15 years because we know that somebody has this thing that can only be countered by what we're proposing? Anyway, my mind is going into the what if mode. I think battleships are cool. I think I said that earlier. I'll say it again. I'm wondering if they'll also have ballistic capability, not just missiles, but shells and energy. There's so much you can do on a massive ship. But I don't know. Part of me is like, why not? Sounds cool. The other part of me that pays taxes is like, whoa, slow down. I'm going to be paying for that, so let's take it easy. But who knows? The primary objective, I think, of the federal government is defense, in my opinion. And this falls in that category. And if it does a good job, then I suppose I would be for it.
Well, lean into your what if, because that's what this episode is all about.
Okay.
What if.
Wonderful.
When naval planners talk about the Trump-class battleship, they are careful with their language. They rarely describe it as a return to the past. Instead, they describe it as a reinterpretation. A ship that borrows the physical presence of a battleship, but is built around modern systems, sensors, and weapons. To understand what that means, we have to look at what this ship is designed to do. Despite the word battleship, the Trump class is not centered on massive naval guns in the traditional sense. Its primary striking power is missile-based. Design concepts describe a ship carrying well over 100 vertical launch system cells, capable of firing a wide range of weapons, including long-range land attack missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, hypersonic weapons, and missile defense interceptors. This makes the Trump class less like an Iowa and more like a floating missile arsenal, a role once envisioned for converted battleships during the Cold War, but never fully realized. What changes here is scale. This is not a destroyer with missiles. It is a capital ship built around them. One of the defining arguments for the Trump class is survivability. Modern surface combatants rely heavily on avoiding hits, using sensors, electronic warfare, and layered missile defense. The Trump class proposal adds something that has largely disappeared from surface ship design: physical resilience. While exact armor schemes have not been released, the emphasis is on redundant systems, compartmentalization, hardened critical spaces, and greater tolerance for damage. The logic is simple. In a missile-saturated environment, not every threat can be intercepted. A ship designed to survive hits and continue fighting becomes extremely valuable. This is classic battleship thinking, updated for the missile age. Another defining feature of the Trump class concept is its integration of emerging technologies. These include high-energy laser systems for drone and missile defense, advanced electronic warfare suites, and space-linked sensors and targeting networks. Supporters argue that a large hull provides the electrical power, cooling, and physical space required for these systems, something smaller ships struggle to accommodate. In this view, size is not excess, size is opportunity. While missiles dominate the design, naval guns are not entirely absent. Proposals include medium-caliber guns capable of firing precision and hypervelocity projectiles, weapons intended for missile defense and shore support rather than traditional naval duels. This reflects a modern understanding of naval gunfire, not as ship-to-ship combat, but as persistent, flexible fire support. It is a quieter role than the thunder of 16-inch guns, but potentially just as important. Another proposed role for the Trump class is a command and control platform. With its size and survivability, the ship could serve as a fleet command ship, or a missile defense coordinator, or even a hub for joint and allied operations. Historically, battleships often served as flagships, not just because of prestige, but because they could survive where others could not. And that logic remains relevant. There is also a strategic element that cannot be measured in tonnage or missile counts: presence. A Trump-class battleship operating forward sends a very different message than a destroyer or even a carrier. It is visible, it is unmistakable, and it signals commitment. Supporters argue that in contested regions, such presence deters aggression by demonstrating that the United States is willing to place major assets in harm's way. Critics counter that this makes the ship a high-value target. Both arguments are valid and deeply rooted in naval history. Equally important is what the Trump class is not meant to replace. It does not replace aircraft carriers. It does not replace submarines. It does not replace destroyers. Instead, it is envisioned as a complement, a ship that fills a role currently spread thin across multiple platforms. Whether that role justifies the cost and complexity remains the central question. Even in concept form, the Trump-class battleship forces the Navy and the public to confront uncomfortable questions. Is the future of naval warfare about dispersal or concentration? Is survivability better achieved through numbers or resilience? And how much presence is too much? These are not new debates, but they have rarely been this visible.
I think those are good questions. When you were describing how it doesn't replace various ships, I kept thinking about each of those ships and what they bring to the table and what the strategy is behind each. And so we've spoken at length in previous episodes about battleships, about submarines in particular, and you couldn't really find two opposite strategies from a ship perspective. And I'm sure once submarines became more popularized and were clearly seen as effective, we started building submarines. But I'm sure there may have been a debate. This is not something that clearly the enemy is using it to great effect. Is that something we want to do? Yes, it is. And I think it's been very effective. Same thing with aircraft carriers. Once we found out how effective planes could be, both from a dogfighting and bombing perspective, having a mobile runway is very handy. And I can only imagine a battleship would. So, number one, the first thing I could think of was Hasbro would be elated with all the new battleship sales that they could push through if these battleships came to the fore, but they'd have to redesign the little plastic pieces, I think, to match this class. However, each ship plays a different role. And we don't have the tanky, grunty, giant ship that could really take punches, especially, like, even if we were to refit an Iowa class, they weren't designed with missiles in mind. You know what I mean? They're like, they can take some shell hits, but if you have target-guided missiles and hit specific weak spots on the ship, it's done. And so to counter that, you would have to design from the ground up with all these new technologies in mind, plus the technologies that you're putting on the ship. So if you have lasers and electronic sweep type capability, you're going to need to shield your ship from that kind of stuff too. And so it is, from an engineering perspective, quite an awesome challenge, but full of possibility. But I think from a military power perspective, it would give a huge advantage to any Navy that would have this at their disposal. Like you could ram an aircraft carrier with this guy and probably do quite a lot. Even if you were out of somehow missiles or whatever, you could still be effective. And I don't know, that sounds pretty cool.
No major warship proposal in American history has ever escaped controversy. And the Trump-class battleship is no exception. In fact, debate is almost built into the DNA of ships like this. Because when you propose something large, expensive, and symbolic, you are not just proposing steel and systems. You are proposing a vision of how a nation intends to fight. And that always invites disagreement. The very first concern raised by critics was cost. Although no finalized budget has been released, estimates place a single Trump-class battleship well above the cost of a modern destroyer and potentially rivaling smaller aircraft carriers. Critics point out A single hull represents a massive investment. Cost overruns are common in first of class warships, and funds directed here are not going to be available elsewhere. In an era of constrained budgets, that matters. Supporters counter that cost alone cannot be the deciding factor, especially if the ship provides capabilities that cannot be easily replaced by multiple smaller platforms. This argument is not new. The same debate surrounded the Iowa class. The same debate surrounded aircraft carriers. The same debate surrounds every capital ship built by every navy in every era. Another major criticism centers on vulnerability. Opponents argue that concentrating so much firepower and symbolism into a single hull creates a prime target, especially in an age of hypersonic weapons and long-range missiles. Why, they ask, build something so big when adversaries are building weapons designed specifically to destroy big things? Supporters respond with a different question. What happens when everything is a missile target? In a conflict with a peer adversary, destroyers, cruisers, and carriers will all be targeted. The Trump class is designed, its advocates argue, to survive that reality better than existing ships. Again, this echoes history. Battleships were once dismissed as too large to survive. Then aircraft carriers were called too vulnerable. Then nuclear submarines were labeled escalatory. Each time the answer came down to doctrine, not size alone. No discussion of the Trump class can avoid the controversy surrounding its name. Traditionally, U.S. Navy surface combatants are named according to established conventions. States, cities, historical figures. Naming a class after a living political figure breaks recent norms and immediately invites political interpretation. Supporters argue that naming conventions evolve and that presidents' names have long been used for aircraft carriers. Critics argue that it risks politicizing the fleet and tying long-term military assets to short-term political movements or moments. The Navy itself has been careful, emphasizing that naming decisions ultimately follow legal and administrative processes, not political branding. Still, the controversy has ensured one thing. This ship is being discussed far beyond naval circles. Perhaps the most substantive criticism is conceptual. Some analysts ask whether the Trump class solves a problem the Navy actually has, or one it wishes it had. Would multiple smaller ships provide more flexibility? Would investment in submarines offer better survivability? Would unmanned systems change the equation entirely? Supporters respond that this is a false choice. They argue that future war at sea will require both dispersion and concentration, and that the Trump class fills a gap that no current platform fully addresses. This debate mirrors earlier arguments over dreadnought versus cruisers, carrier versus battleships, nuclear submarines versus conventional fleets. History offers no simple answer, only consequences. Inside the Navy, reactions are mixed. Some officers see the proposal as an overdue correction, a return to survivability and firepower after decades of prioritizing efficiency and speed. Others worry that introducing a new capital ship class complicates logistics, training, and fleet composition at a time when the Navy is already stretched. These internal debates are not signs of weakness. They are signs of a healthy institution grappling with change. Unlike many weapons programs, the Trump class announcement immediately entered public consciousness. That brings advantages: transparency, debate, accountability, but it also brings risk. Shipbuilding programs live or die in Congress. Public perception matters, And once a program becomes symbolic, compromise becomes harder. Whether the Trump class survives that process remains to be seen. But one thing is already clear. This is no longer just a ship proposal. It is a national conversation about how the United States intends to project power at sea in the decades ahead.
So you're reminding me of a couple of things with everything you just said. I think it's all extremely valid. Number one, I want to validate that. Second, in the movie, The Final Countdown, which, listener, you should watch. It's really cool. There is a time travel element that the USS Nimitz goes back to just before World War II before the attack on Pearl Harbor. And somebody says, hey, your ship is named after a living admiral. What's up with that? That is not what we do. And so I remember watching that thinking, yeah, what kind of hubris would that be if they actually did that? And fast forward today, I'm like, oh, that's the kind of hubris it would be. I get it. Okay. So that said, speaking of aircraft carriers, though, I remember reading something maybe a year ago, but it was solidified this year about a hypersonic missile that China was developing. I think it was nicknamed the Carrier Killer, and it's basically something that they can put on a destroyer, launch, and it goes so fast that carriers really can't do anything about it, and it devastates them. And so, clearly, that is something that we probably don't have a very good defense for, and if we're going to move a capital ship aircraft carrier to a region that needs support or to send a message, it is now extremely vulnerable to a technology like that. I can see where the battleship would, if it was designed appropriately, shoot as many hypersonic missiles as you want. It's still going to be able to go, maybe not as many as you want. That could be, there is a limit. But the thinking is it's going to be able to take a punch and still project power. Whereas sending an aircraft carrier, which is much more vulnerable and needs a complement of other ships to defend it, wouldn't be able to do that. So I get it. And there is a need as different, what's the right word? Not necessarily countries, but as different technologies emerge that potential enemies can employ against what we have, we need to be prepared. We need to be forward thinking. And it would be foolhardy to just keep building what we're building now, or even just slightly retrofitting when the entire paradigm of warfare is changing.
Every major warship ever built has faced the same question. Not, can it be built? But does it fit the way wars are actually fought? For the Trump-class battleship, that question sits at the heart of the debate. Because modern American naval doctrine looks very different from the doctrine that produced the great battleships of the 20th century. Today's Navy is built around a few core assumptions: long-range detection and targeting, networked sensors and shooters, distributed lethality, and joint and allied operations. In this framework, no single ship fights alone. Every platform contributes data, weapons, or protection to the larger system. Aircraft carriers provide air power, submarines provide stealth and strike, destroyers provide defense and flexibility. The Trump-class proposal challenges this model, not by rejecting it, by asking whether something is missing. One recurring concern in modern doctrine is endurance. Missile combat is fast and violent. A ship can expend its weapons quickly. Damage can force withdrawal. Supporters of the Trump class argue that modern surface combatants are optimized for efficiency, not longevity under fire. They see the Trump class's ship designed to absorb damage, carry large magazines, remain on station longer, and continue operating when others must pull back. This is classic battleship logic, updated for a missile-heavy battlefield. For the last 2 decades, the Navy has emphasized distributed lethality, spreading firepower across many platforms to complicate enemy targeting. Critics argue the Trump class moves in the opposite direction. Why concentrate so much power in one hull? Supporters respond that dispersion alone does not solve every problem. In some scenarios, particularly contested littorals or missile defense, concentration matters. A heavily defended, heavily armed ship can act as a shield for others. History offers parallels. Carrier task forces concentrate power. Ballistic missile submarines concentrate deterrence. The question is not whether concentration is dangerous. It always is. But whether it is sometimes necessary. Deterrence is not about weapons. It is about belief. Supporters of the Trump class argue that a large, survivable surface combat operating forward sends a clear message. The United States expects to fight and endure it in contested environments. That visibility is intentional. And unlike submarines, which deter quietly, a battleship-like ship deters openly. Critics counter that deterrence can be achieved more cheaply and flexibly through submarines, aircraft, and alliances. Both views have merit, and both have shaped U.S. naval strategy at different times. Another proposed role for the Trump class is as a joint operations hub. With its size and survivability, it could coordinate missile defense, naval fires, allied task groups, and multi-domain operations. Historically, battleships often served as command ships because they could survive where others could not. In a high-threat environment, that role may once again be relevant, but it also raises questions. Does the Navy want command concentrated or dispersed and redundant? There is no settled answer, only trade-offs. One lesson from naval history is that doctrine and ships evolve together. Battleships shaped doctrine, carriers reshaped it, submarines forced new thinking. If the Trump class were built, doctrine would have to adapt to it, just as it always has. The real question is whether the Navy wants to adapt in that direction. More than anything else, the Trump-class battleship tests assumptions that have gone largely unchallenged for decades. That big ships are inherently too vulnerable, that armor no longer matters, and that visibility is a liability rather than a tool. Whether those assumptions still hold in a missile-saturated, sensor-dense world is not yet clear. And that uncertainty is precisely why this proposal exists.
That is really lucid. I really appreciate what you're saying there. In order to save money long term, having the right tool for the right job is indispensable. Like, you need it. And sometimes that tool is very expensive. And it's like, do I want to justify getting this tool to help me with this thing? But having this tool at my disposal means even though I might not need it all the time, when I do need it, it's there and I can use it and I can be made whole again. That's a great feeling. And I can expand that to the variety of the arsenal of ships at the disposal of the U.S. Navy. It's, you're trying to accomplish an objective and you have a lot of tools, but not quite the right tool. It becomes complicated. It becomes difficult to achieve without compromises or sacrifices or, like you said, some kind of trade-off. And so having this tool may be very beneficial. Maybe they don't concentrate everything on this ship, but I think having something that fits a specific category without making itself too vulnerable is a good decision. Again, as a taxpayer, not crazy about that, but again, it's like buying a tool for your house. The value may definitively outweigh the cost, and maybe that is something we need to look at. Imagine a Navy today without carriers or without submarines, things that were controversial and people, I'm sure, debated just the same. Or you can even look past the Navy. What about the jet fighters that we have, or the bombers, or Apache helicopters? Does the Army need helicopters? They are very effective. It's a great tool that they have at their disposal in specific circumstances. So I'm not one to green light every single potential military plan, but it does need to be carefully thought. If this is a tool that we need, we should invest in it, but we should do economically. Frugally seems too far, but with the right balance.
Ideas are easy. Steel is hard. Every ambitious warship program eventually collides with reality. Shipyards, skilled labor, training pipelines, budgets, and time. And if the Trump-class battleship ever moves beyond concept, it will do so not on paper, but in American shipyards. And that alone makes this proposal historically significant. The United States has not built a battleship-sized surface combatant in generations. Modern shipyards are optimized for aircraft carriers, submarines, destroyers, and amphibious ships. A Trump-class hull, larger than a destroyer, more complex than a cruiser, and built around high-energy systems would stretch existing industrial capacity. Supporters argue that this is precisely the point. They see the Trump class as a way to revitalize heavy shipbuilding skills, to expand industrial capacity, and to reintroduce redundancy into the naval base. Critics respond that the industrial base is already strained, and that adding a new class risks delays and cost overruns across the fleet. Both views are grounded in reality. History offers cautionary examples. The first ship of any new class is almost always going to cost more and take longer than planned. The Iowa class faced delays. Early aircraft carriers faced skepticism. Even modern destroyers encountered redesigns and overruns. Supporters of the Trump class argue that complexity should not paralyze innovation. Critics argue that innovation without discipline becomes excess. This tension is not new. It is the constant companion of naval progress. Another practical question is manpower. Battleships once required thousands of sailors. That is no longer feasible or desirable in a modern navy. Design concepts for the Trump class emphasize automation, reduced crew size, advanced damage control systems, and integrated training. Even so, a ship of this size would require more sailors than a destroyer, and those sailors would need specialized skills. That raises questions. Where do they come from? How are they trained? And how does this affect overall fleet manpower? Supporters argue that a larger crew also means greater resilience, more hands to fight fires, repair damage, and sustain operations. Once again, the argument returns to survivability. For sailors serving aboard a Trump-class battleship would be unlike serving on any current service combatant. It would be larger, more complex, more visible, and more symbolically charged. Historically, sailors assigned to battleships understood they were serving aboard something different, something that carried the weight of national attention. That would almost certainly be true again. The ship would not just be a workplace, it would be a statement. Training presents its own challenges. A Trump-class battleship blends missile warfare, air defense, electronic warfare, command and control, and damage control on a large scale. This requires crews trained across multiple disciplines and trained to fight through damage rather than avoid it. That mindset alone could mark a shift in surface warfare culture. Large ships demand large commitments. Dry docks, spare parts, specialized facilities. Supporters argue that fewer, more durable ships may be easier to sustain than many lightly built ones. Critics counter that maintenance costs for capital ships historically grow over time, often unpredictably. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. What often gets lost in debates about technology is the human element. Ships do not fight alone. People fight wars. If built, the Trump class would depend on sailors trained not just to operate advanced systems, but to endure, to stay at sea, to absorb damage, to keep fighting when conditions deteriorate. That is a battleship tradition that technology has never replaced. Ultimately, deciding whether to build the Trump-class battleship is not just a procurement choice. It is a statement about how the United States values industrial capability or capacity, how it views survivability, and how it prepares sailors for future wars. Those decisions outlast administrations and even ships themselves.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because the first thing I thought of when you were bringing up this topic was there's going to be a lot of people on that ship, like a lot of people. And I don't know if it would equal top of the line aircraft carrier just because there's moving parts on a ship like that where this one would be.
Modern aircraft carrier has a crew with the air wing of about 5,000.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I don't think it would be that many, but it would definitely be over 1,000. The other thing I kept thinking about, so yeah, that would be one gap we need to consider. How do we get that many people on that ship? Do we take them from other complements, like some from destroyers or some? Anyway, that isn't a problem all in and of itself. The second thing I thought of was I know that from an industrial capacity perspective, America does not have enough welders, for example. And like I've seen calls come out from businesses like Ford. We need 5,000 welders right now. And if you have this skill, please, we will hire you. And as a father, I should encourage my kids to weld because not only will they have a job in many other capacities, but if the Trump-class battleship becomes a reality, there is definitely going to be a need in shipyards wherever they decide to build this for that kind of skill set. Not just welding specifically, but any number of different skills required to put something like this together. I assume a ship that massive will probably be nuclear powered. Again, all the technology that goes into building and maintaining and sustaining that kind of ship is going to be necessary. Do we have that capacity now? Maybe. We'd have to reallocate a lot of things. With an economy like ours, it's a trade-off. We might, but we need to reinvest, and some other things may not get the investment that it's getting now. This is a challenge on so many different dimensions, and the human element alone is tricky. At the end of each segment, I'm like, we can try it, but it's going to take some people with a lot more decisiveness, control than what I'm presenting right now. I can opine on a podcast, but if you're in charge of getting this to see, we need some decision makers. And I'm glad we're in an environment where a robust debate can happen to ensure that we're being responsible.
In naval history, the distance between an announcement and a ship at sea can be measured not in months, but in decades. For the Trump-class battleship, that distance is still very long because no matter how bold the concept or how dramatic the unveiling, a warship does not exist until it survives the slow, grinding machinery of policy, budgets, and politics. The first hurdle for any new ship class is authorization. That means formal Navy requirements, Department of Defense approval, congressional authorization, and ultimately, funding. Many proposed ships never make it past this stage. History is full of paper ships, designs that looked promising, stirred debate, and then quietly disappeared. The Trump class now enters that long tradition. Its future will depend less on headlines and more on committee rooms, budget markups, and strategic priorities. Congress holds the real power over shipbuilding. Lawmakers will ask hard questions. What threat does this ship counter? Why can't existing ships do the job? How many are needed? And what gets cut to pay for them? Often, support often depends on geography. Shipbuilding states may favor the program. Others may see it as a distraction from submarines, carriers, or readiness. History shows that capital ships survive only when they build broad coalitions, political as much as military. Timing also matters. If global tensions rise, arguments for survivability, heavily armed surface combatants gain traction. If budgets tighten or priorities shift, ambitious programs are often the first to be trimmed. The Trump class arrives at a moment of uncertainty, renewed great power competition, but also intense pressure on naval resources. That makes its path forward neither impossible nor assured. The Navy has been here before. In the Cold War, proposals emerged for missile battleships, arsenal ships, and heavily armed surface combatants that blurred the lines between cruiser and capital ship. Some were tested. Some were partially built. Most were abandoned. But each influenced thinking. Even when ships were not built, their ideas shaped later designs, influencing destroyers, cruisers, and missile doctrine. The Trump class may do the same, even if it never sails. There is an important truth in naval history. Sometimes the idea matters as much as the ship. The Trump class has already forced the Navy, Congress, and the public to reconsider long-standing assumptions. That armor no longer matters, that size is always a liability, and that survivability must yield to efficiency. These debates will not disappear, regardless of what happens to this program. Success does not necessarily mean a fleet of Trump-class battleships. It could mean new survivability standards for surface ships, or larger missile magazines on future designs, greater emphasis on endurance and damage tolerance, or a hybrid platform that borrows from this concept. Naval evolution is rarely linear. It is iterative, shaped by ideas, trials, and lessons. If the Trump class is built, it will be one of the most significant naval design decisions in generations. If it is not built, it will still leave a mark, as a reminder that naval warfare is not settled, and that even long-retired ideas can return when conditions change. Either way, history will note this moment, because it marked the first serious public reconsideration of the battleship concept in nearly a century.
You just touched on something that I hadn't realized at all. This is a huge ask as far as what they're trying to put in. It's like this class of battleship is a wish list of, yeah, if I was in charge of the Navy and had access to unlimited funds and technologies and whatever, this is what I would do. Clearly, that has to meet reality somewhere, but this just could be a huge negotiation ploy. It's, yeah, hey, this is where we're going to start. And you're like, oh, no way, that can't be done. So what if we, and then you reduce the complement that's on the ship, or maybe the technologies to existing ships. So, like maybe modern aircraft carriers have some of these elements, or destroyers or something. So it's not a brand new ship, but it's newer ships of types that we have to be more robust. Who knows? It could be just a big ploy to get the conversation started from a point that may seem so extreme in some cases that any kind of give seems like a victory. Oh, at least we're not paying $3 billion or $3 trillion or however much it's going to cost. We're only paying half. And so that seems like a win, but you're still paying a lot of money for something. So I could see that element also. But like you said, in any event, it is an inflection point of, hey, what are we doing with the Navy? Let's re-examine what we should be building, what kind of power we want to project, how we're going to fight, all of that. And it helps podcasts like ours have Not that we have a limited amount of history to talk about. There's a lot of history and a lot of naval warfare that goes back millennia. But this is also something very exciting to talk about.
Every era of naval history leaves behind a question that later generations cannot ignore. For the age of sail, it was how wind and wood could shape empires. For the dreadnought era, it was how steel and industrial refined power. And for the carrier age, it was how air power changed everything. And now, in the early 21st century, the Trump-class battleship proposal raises a new question. What does naval power need to look like in an age of missiles, sensors, and constant surveillance? Whether the Trump class is built or not, it has already served a purpose. It has forced a reconsideration of assumptions that went largely unchallenged for decades. Assumptions about vulnerability, survivability, and presence. Reminds us that naval warfare is not static. Technology changes. Threats evolve. Old ideas return, not unchanged, but reimagined. The Trump class is not a return to the past. It is a question posed to the future. Historically, battleships have always been more than weapons. They were symbols of industrial power, of national confidence, of a willingness to place something large and valuable in harm's way. That symbolism never truly disappeared. Even today, the sight of a massive surface warship offshore carries weight. Political, psychological, and even strategic. The Trump-class proposal draws on that tradition, whether intentionally or not. It suggests that presence still matters, that endurance still matters, and that resilience may once again be worth the cost. Naval history teaches patience. The value of a ship design is rarely obvious at birth. Battleships were once revolutionary, then obsolete, then briefly reborn. Aircraft carriers were once dismissed, then decisive. Submarines were once novelties, then strategic cornerstones. The Trump class now joins a long list of ideas awaiting judgment. That judgment will not come from announcements or arguments. It will come from events. Perhaps the most important takeaway is not about steel or missiles, but about mindset. The debate surrounding the Trump class shows a Navy actively questioning itself. Are we too focused on efficiency? Have we traded resilience for elegance? Are we preparing for the wars we want, or the wars we might actually fight? These are healthy questions. They reflect an institution that understands history and refuses to be trapped by it. Navies do not build ships just to fight. They build them to reassure allies, to shape behavior, and to signal intent. The Trump-class battleship, whether real or unrealized, signals something important, that the United States Navy is still searching, still adapting, still willing to change long-held beliefs about what power at sea looks like. And in that search, in itself, is part of naval history. Here, we explore these moments not as verdicts, but as chapters, snapshots of a Navy in motion, shaped by the past and reaching towards the future. The Trump-class battleship may one day sail, or it may remain a footnote. But either way, it reminds us that the story of sea power is never finished.
I think that's really well said again. What I admire as we've gone through many episodes of this podcast is how the U.S. Navy is willing to accept lessons from sometimes unconventional sources to be better and to not hold so fast to traditions that may compromise our ability to fight. I think there was one episode in particular I'm thinking of where there was a Swedish submarine that was so quiet and stealthy that it could easily penetrate our defenses. And rather than throwing our hands up or being belligerent to the Swedes, we invited them in and said, please teach us more about what you're doing. in that way, we will grow. We will be better. And from that, we were able to adapt tactics and technologies and training so that we could be a more effective fighting force. I can see that spirit in what you're saying here. It's we don't want to make too many assumptions about what types of ships or what types of tactics even, but the core of who we are remains unchanged. We are an honorable, effective fighting force, and we will stand our ground there, but the tools and tactics we use are allowed to change as we see fit. We can be flexible in the face of a different danger or enemy. This is an iteration on that theme, and I think that's great. I think that's very good. I am very curious where this goes, and if it sails, I can go, yeah, we talked about that way back when. You should check out this podcast episode. But yeah, it's worth thinking about and talking about and trying to put aside assumptions or reservations that you may have initially that could block certain things. Like this could be an automatic no for you just because of the cost or the name or it's fine the way it is or what danger do we have or all that stuff. But having a measured approach and trying to think as objectively as you can about why we would even think about producing something like this is worthwhile, I think.
At the end of every one of our episodes, we like to honor one of our fallen heroes, and I will ask apologies right now if I mispronounce his name. That is not intentional. Today we want to honor Master Sergeant Audancio Serio. His hometown was Killeen, Texas. His branch was with the U.S. Army, Company A, 57th Infantry Regiment, Philippine Scouts. He received the Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, Purple Heart. His date of sacrifice was February 24th, 1964, at Fort Hood, Texas. He was 52. Master Sergeant Licerio was a career soldier who served his country in 3 different conflicts: World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. Born in Pandacan, Manila, the Philippines, Licerio became a naturalized U.S. citizen and served with the U.S. Army in World War II with the Philippine Scouts. On December 8th, 1941, Imperial Japan invaded the Philippines just 10 hours after attacking the American fleet in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. According to the U.S. Army's description of the Philippine Scouts, these were General Douglas MacArthur's soldiers, the guys who fought America's first battle of World War II, the Philippine Division. Probably the best trained and possibly the best prepared U.S. Army division at the outset of the war. Some of them were farm boys from California and Kansas, and Italian Americans from New Jersey, as depicted in the black and white movies made during and after World War II. However, many of them were professional Filipino soldiers serving in the U.S. Army, commanded by American officers. They were special men in special units, officially designated Philippine Scouts, a term applied to both the Filipino enlisted men and their American officers. For a young Filipino man, acceptance into the Philippine Scouts was a distinct honor, as was service in the scout units for American officers. For his actions in the battle to hold the Bataan Peninsula on the island of Luzon, Licerio was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. His citation reads, "The President of the United States of America, authorized by Act of Congress, July 9, 1918, takes pleasure in presenting the Distinguished Service Cross to Staff Sergeant, then Sergeant, Licerio, Army Serial Number 6866189, United States Army, for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy while serving with Company A, 57th Infantry Regiment, Philippine Scouts, in action against enemy forces on 28 March 1942 at Bataan in the Philippine Islands. During the Battle of Anson Point, Staff Sergeant Licerio was designated by his company commander as leader of a suicide squad. Under heavy enemy fire, Sergeant Licerio engaged the enemy with hand grenades, thereby enabling his battalion to go forward and later to take the enemy positions. Staff Sergeant Licerio's intrepid actions personal bravery, and zealous devotion to duty exemplify the highest traditions of the military forces of the United States and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army. The American forces' success in the Battle of Antietam Point was short-lived, as there were no reinforcements or basic supplies on the way. Their ordeal was just beginning. For 3 months, the American and Filipino soldiers held out, despite a lack of naval and air support. Malnourished and exhausted, there was no choice for U.S. General Edward King Jr. but to surrender to the larger and better equipped Japanese forces. 75,000 surviving Filipino-American defenders of Bataan were marched 65 miles to Japanese prisoner of war camps. The Japanese provided no water, food, or medical care to the prisoners. Along the way, the captors brutalized their prisoners, beating and murdering them with bayonets, later known as the infamous Bataan Death March. More than 10,000 men were lost. A survivor of the Battle of Antietam Point and the Bataan Death March, Licerio continued his career as a U.S. soldier, serving during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Master Sergeant Licerio died of natural causes while stationed at Fort Hood in Killeen, Texas, on February 29, 1964, at the age of 52. 5 decades after his death, the Congress of the United States honored Filipino veterans of World War II with the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor awarded in the United States. More than 250,000 Filipinos, including Master Sergeant Licerio, fought with the American troops from July 1941 to December 1946. At the ceremony on October 25, 2017, House Speaker Paul Ryan remarked, "This is a day that is long, long overdue. Everyone knows about Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Perhaps lesser known is that within hours, Japan forces also invaded the Philippines. American and Filipino forces fought side by side to stave off the invasion. The speaker credited the Filipinos for their incredible valor and sacrifice that helped lead Allied powers to victory in the Pacific and European theaters of World War II. So, Master Sergeant Licerio, we thank you."
Thank you.
All right, get us out of here.
Cool. First of all, thank you so much, listening audience, for joining us for this episode. We really couldn't do this without you. We could try to do it without you, but it would be just me and Dale talking, and that's not as great when you're not with us. So I from the bottom of my heart, really, thank you for choosing us to spend some time with. If you ever feel motivated enough to contact us, maybe we've mentioned something or you have some insight on a topic or whatever, there's a couple of different ways you can do that. You can email us. The email address is usnavyhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on X Twitter. The handle is @USNHistoryPod. And then you can also find a Discord server if you look in the show notes. The link there will lead you to the server where you can talk to us. You can talk to other listeners. You can talk with each other. You can discuss whatever you want. And it's always cool to find like-minded individuals that you can share ideas with. And so we invite you. And as always, feel free to tell a friend, a family member, a coworker, a classmate about this podcast. And you can feel free to rate this podcast. And when you rate, I always like it when you add a note about why you gave it the number of stars you did. Maybe you like the timbre of Dale's voice, and you should let him know that, because it's nice. Anyway, so thank you again, and I look forward to hanging out with you guys later.
And with that, we're going to wish you all fair winds and following seas. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.